Today we're going to begin our viewing of the film Gone with the Wind, most popular movie of all time. As some of you watch it, you may well wonder why. Others of you will absolutely love it. That's been my experience. I've been showing this film for well over 30 years. It is the one thing that I show every year to all of my AP students. And there are a number of good reasons for that, which I'll get into a little bit later. But before we actually watch the film, there's a bit of introductory material that I would like for you to get. First, I would like to introduce you to this rather cute little girl here. Her name is Margaret Mitchell. She was born in 1900, and she is an upper middle class girl growing up in Atlanta, Georgia. Her father was an attorney. Her mother was a college-educated woman, which was very unusual during her generation. She had a grandmother who had lived through the Civil War. Her grandmother lived through the Civil War as a teenager. That's going to be really important to our story as time goes by. She spent an incredible amount of time with this grandmother. Both of her parents were very busy people. Her father was, as I said before, a practicing attorney. He was in a fair amount of demand in Atlanta, Georgia. They were socially well connected. Her mother was very active in the women's suffrage movement. And as it ended up happening, a great deal of the time that Margaret Mitchell was spending as a child, she was spending with her grandmother. And they were raised in a home that was often referred to as the Stevens Mansion. This was her maternal grandmother, her grandmother Stevens, who lived very, very well. And eventually that house burned. So we don't have pictures of it. This is the house they built after that house burned. So you can get some idea of the relative wealth of the Mitchell family from looking at this photograph. You can also perhaps get some idea of how southern this family viewed themselves. Now this is a house in the city. It is on Peachtree Street. The street still exists in Georgia. The house is long gone. In fact, it was torn down at Margaret Mitchell's instructions because she didn't want people tramping through her bedroom and so on. As she became more famous, she resented the fact that she had become famous, and so she asked her brother, who inherited the house, to have it demolished before he moved out of it. So at any rate, Margaret Mitchell is, she's a child of the century. She's born in 1900. And so as the Roaring Twenties is dawning, she becomes something of a flapper. She spent a year at Smith College in the late 19-teens, where she became engaged to a young man who died in the First World War. Her mother died soon after that. She returned to Georgia to take care of her father and run that household. But that didn't take anywhere near her whole time. And she had some ambitions, and so she became a journalist. Now, for a woman to become a journalist in the 1920s meant that usually she was going to end up writing on what was then called the women's page. And she wrote a lot of society news. She did some interviews. You can see a photograph here of her interviewing the man who was at the time, in the early 1920s, sort of the heartthrob of every woman in the country, Rudolph Valentino. And so she becomes a journalist. She works for the Atlanta Constitution. She is running her father's household as well, but that basically means that she's telling the servants what to do. So she's leading this kind of dual life when she falls in love once again and gets married. And she gets married, and unfortunately this picture is rather hazy, so it doesn't come out with the clarity that I would like. But you can see her here in her wedding dress, looking very, very 1920s. This is actually 1922. And she is marrying the much taller man standing next to her. and his name was Berrien Red Upshaw. Remember that name, because it's going to figure into our story a little bit. Now, their marriage was extremely tempestuous. Most people of that generation did not write about how tempestuous it was. There were allegations of certainly mental abuse. He was an alcoholic, or at least he developed alcoholism later in life. He may have been physically abusive. We don't know. What we do know is that within 2 years, that marriage was over. And interestingly enough, she married for a second time a man who was much more settled, a man that she had considered marrying before she married Upshaw. But Upshaw was just a more exciting guy. And her second husband, John Marsh, was a much more staid character, a much more settled person. Now, interestingly enough, he was also the best man in her first wedding. Marsh and Upshaw had been college roommates. They were very good friends. Upshaw was sort of the, if you will, to use somewhat more modern terms, Upshaw was the player and Marsh was kind of the wingman. And so they were very well acquainted. As I said, she had considered marrying Marsh before she married Upshaw. She rejected Marsh, married Upshaw. The Upshaw marriage went badly. Marsh, who was very much in love with her, stuck around, and eventually they were married. Now, at this point, her life seems to be settling down quite nicely. She is a married lady. She has something of a career as a society journalist, at least a part-time career. She and her husband rented the apartment that you can see here. And this is a modern reconstruction of it. It's, for the most part, not the original furniture, but it's very much like what they lived in at the time. This is the actual space. The furniture is reproduction for the most part. Anyway, in 1926, she had an equestrian accident. The horse fell over and crushed her ankle. And it was not just a break, it was a shatter. And in 1926, there were very few things that you could do. The use of metal in the human body was still way in the future. Basically, the best thing they could do was put it in a cast and wait for the bone to heal. That was a very long process. She's stuck at home. There is radio by 1926, but she's rapidly bored by what's on the radio. And she's sitting in this room, and you can see this window seat in the back of the room. And she spent most of her days, with her, all sort of propped up. You can imagine her with the pillows and her leg raised and looking out the window and sort of wishing that she was out there, but she couldn't because she couldn't walk and so on. And this was months that she is sort of convalescing in that window seat. And she decided at that point to take the stories that she had heard of the Old South, most of them at her grandmother's knee, and weave them together into a story. And this is just purely her own amusement. She's bored to tears. She is a writer. She's going to write. She doesn't have the ability to get out of the house, so she has to write stuff that's already in her mind. And what's in her mind are all these stories that she heard from her grandmother. Again, the grandmother was a teenager, Southern white teenager in Atlanta during the Civil War. And when Margaret was a child and was spending so very much time with her grandmother, oftentimes her grandmother would go visiting. And of course, the people that she visited were people like her, the people that she had known for years, the people that had also gone through the Civil War as teenagers. And they would sit on the porch if it was the summertime, in the parlor if it was the winter, and her grandmother and her grandmother's friends would sit and visit, and there would be the sort of typical thing that older women talk about, probably a little more than a little bit of gossip about this person or that, and what was going on in their lives. But almost inevitably, the conversation would turn to the most exciting thing these people had ever lived through, the Civil War. And so you had this group of women who, as teenagers in the Civil War, were just basically telling each other their stories. Now, they'd probably all heard their stories because they'd all grown up together. But nonetheless, this was a popular topic of conversation. So Margaret is sitting there, age somewhere between 5 and 15, and she's sort of taking in these stories. She had been taught that, and very much in the mold that children are seen but not heard, and so she is sitting quietly while she and her grandmother, while her grandmother and her grandmother's friends are sharing these stories. But she's interested in the stories. She finds them fascinating. Again, no radio, no television yet. This is basically 1905 to 1915, so those things are still in the future. And so the most exciting thing that Margaret ever hears are these stories that her grandmother and her grandmother's friends are telling. So she remembers them. And in 1926, 10 years after she stopped visiting with her grandmother, she begins to take those stories, some of them her grandmother's, some of them her grandmother's friends, and wove them together into a novel. Now, again, she never intended to publish this. It is purely done for her own amusement. And eventually she healed, and she would work on this thing erratically. I mean, she might work on it, feverishly for a couple of weeks, and then she'd set it aside because other things were going on in her life, and it might be several months before she got back to it. But she always kind of, for over the next 10 years or so, she is sort of working on this novel. And she's not composing it in any sort of order. She's just putting the stories together in sort of this random, haphazard fashion. Again, purely for her own amusement. In 1935, so this is now 9 years after she has started writing this, it's basically 25 to 30, 35 years after she's heard the stories, a representative from Macmillan Publishing Company was in Atlanta, and he was looking for things to publish. He was looking for particularly good Southern novels. Southern novels were very popular during the Great Depression for a number of reasons. Partially it was the fact that there was the Great Depression was this economic cataclysm, and we, of course, studied that at the time. And the Southern novel, which were usually stories of the Civil War, of the disaster of the Civil War, at least viewed from a Southern white perspective. And these books enjoyed quite a degree of popularity. And in fact, you can look back. There are lots of movies that were done at the time with a Southern basis. Gone with the Wind is simply the most famous of them, but there were lots of others. And so these stories of adversity and the Civil War, and of course the big houses and the big costumes and, this very settled way of life that suddenly disappeared, these stories had a certain popularity. They resonated with this Depression-era audience who were kind of in some respects going through a similar thing themselves. So anyway, this guy from Macmillan Publishing is in Atlanta, and he's looking for a manuscript to publish. And he has a friend who is also a friend of Peggy Mitchell's. Remember, Peggy was working, and I'm sorry, Peggy is a common nickname for Margaret, or at least it was at the time. And so Peggy Mitchell was working part-time at the Atlanta Constitution. Her editor, the editor of the Woman's Page, was a friend of this guy from Macmillan Publishing Company, or at least they knew each other. And he suggested, the editor suggested that this fellow contact Peggy Mitchell and look at this novel. And the editor had read parts of it over time. Yeah, she would come in and she would share it and whatnot. And so he's suggesting this guy from Macmillan, go talk to Peggy Mitchell. She's got this novel. She's been writing it for years. I've not read the whole thing, but what I've read of it is pretty good. And so he goes over to their home, and she is pretty reluctant at first. I mean, she's a very, very private person. And she was a little reluctant to let anybody outside see this story because it was kind of her personal little pet project, and she was always concerned that perhaps she had revealed a little too much of herself, or things that were kind of nobody else's business. But nonetheless, eventually he persuades her to let her read part of it, and he loves it. And he then works on her, and it took months for him just to persuade her to publish it. Finally, he did. I just exactly how, I don't know. Appeal to her vanity, whatever. But nonetheless, he persuades her to publish this thing. And it immediately begins a kind of search around the house. Because as she wrote it, she would put bunches of pages in these brown manila envelopes. And these manila envelopes were kind of all over the place. She's rummaging around. You can always imagine this. She's looking in the bottom of the drawers in her chest of drawers, the floor of the closet, the shelf of the closet, just wherever she could put them. She didn't want to throw them away. They had no real use, so she basically put them away over the years. Eventually, they indeed found about a half a dozen of these envelopes that were actually supporting the rear leg of the sofa. The leg of the sofa had broken, and she'd pulled out this bunch of papers in their envelopes, and she'd kind of stuffed them in under there to keep the sofa level, and then had kind of forgotten that they were there. So it took them months to rewrite it. It finally gets published in 1936, and it is a smash hit. Just incredible. Despite the fact that it's 1,037 pages, but it turns out to be an incredibly popular book, even at the then very high price of $3 a copy. So, with this incredibly popular book, there's a mad dash among Hollywood studios to get the film rights. Hollywood is very competitive. Whenever there was a breakout story, the people from MGM and Universal and 20th Century Fox and so on, and they're all writing letters and calling Margaret Mitchell to try to persuade them to sell them the rights to make the movie version of her book. And just like the guy from Macmillan Publishing, she says no, and she says no, and she says no, and she says no, and she says no. And finally, somebody from a much smaller studio, the studio of a man named David O. Selznick, who would play his own very important role in movie history, and we don't have time to get into that right now. But the Selznick studio made her an offer of $50,000. And that is just an outrageous amount of money for the rights to make a film from a book. Remember, she's not selling them a physical object. She's selling them the rights to make her novel into a movie. And this is now 1937, and in 1937 you could purchase a new Ford automobile for $700, and so they're offering her $50,000 to make this movie, and she finally acquiesces. Even though she was societally well-connected, they weren't extremely rich. They were very comfortable, but they weren't extremely rich. And so finally, she sees this immense amount of money, at least to her, and she agrees to it. But she wants nothing to do with the making of the movie. She has a friend who was willing to go to Hollywood and sort of be Miss Mitchell's stand-in and make sure that what was being done was accurate. And the Hollywood people were very concerned, because when you take a 1,037-page novel that is incredibly popular, and already by 1937 you had people who had memorized big passages of it, and so they realized that if they were going to make this movie, it had to be done right. And when you consider the job of taking 1,000 pages of text and making it into a movie that doesn't take 15 years to show in the theater, obviously there's going to have to be some cutting done. It's going to have to be a very, very delicate process. And it's got to be done right. Because these people in the South, if it's not accurate, all of Margaret Mitchell's friends, and maybe even Margaret Mitchell herself, would denounce this thing. And that was a disaster that the movie people were going to avoid at all costs. So nonetheless, so the movie gets made. And it opened on December 15th, 1939. It was the biggest movie opening of the year. You can see on the screen a picture of the theater where it opened. Interestingly enough, because it's set in Atlanta, it opened in the city of Atlanta. This is the movie theater. They built a false front of a plantation house on the front of the theater temporarily, just for this movie. You can see the picture of the two stars, and it's like, 12 feet high over top of it on the side of the building, and the limousines pulling up and the big lights. And this was the biggest night sleepy Atlanta had ever seen, at least since the night that General Sherman had come through and burned the place down. So this is a big, big deal. So, that being said, why are we watching this thing? Why are we going to sit here? Why am I going to impose upon you to sit through a 4-hour movie that was made in 1939? Well, first, it's part of our cultural heritage. I think you'll be surprised as you see it how many words, how many phrases there are in this movie that have actually entered your life. Even if you have not seen the movie, they were just words that became catchphrases. For instance, the very last line in the movie is, "Tomorrow is another day." And it is said with great feeling. And over the years, many of my students have found that to be just the most unfortunate ending, because after this huge movie, it ends with this cliche. Tomorrow is another day. Well, it wasn't a cliche when the movie was made in 1939. It became a cliche because of the movie. And there are all kinds of places in this movie where you may recognize phrases, recognize situations that have entered the language, that have just kind of become part of our cultural heritage. Second, and probably much more importantly, Gone with the Wind offers us a chance to see the Civil War and Reconstruction, at least in a sort of secondhand way, through the eyes of the people who lived through it themselves. That doesn't happen very often. Most of the women, like Margaret Mitchell's grandmother, really did not write a lot about it. They talked about it. They talked about it with their friends, but they didn't write about it. Some of them kept diaries, some of them sent letters, but the very process of writing about it is very different than the process of speaking about it. And the reading of a diary or a letter is very different than seeing something up on a screen. So what this does is that it shows you the Civil War and Reconstruction from the point of view of a teenage white Southern woman. It's a very unusual perspective. And that has an effect. Because Gone with the Wind, in one way, mirrors the society which created it, the South of Reconstruction, the South of Jim Crow. And it also helps perpetuate it because it is so gorgeous. And one of the things that the color in Gone with the Wind will pop your eyes out. It's very colorful. This was one of the first color movies that was made. And it is color. Big color. Bright color. Especially at the beginning and then again at the end. Now the colors will get a little more muted as the Civil War gets worse and worse and worse from a Southern point of view, and somewhat more muted during the early days of Reconstruction, which is really the bottom of the story from a white Southern female point of view. That's when it really gets bad, in the early stages of Reconstruction. But then it'll get bright again. And, and partially this is kind of showing off. Mr. Selznick had spent massive amounts of money, much more money than he could afford, to produce this movie in color. And he wanted to make sure people knew that it had been done in color. There's nothing in this movie that looks black and white. But it was such an attractive scene. So many people looked at the old South, the South before the Civil War, the South that you will see in the first half hour of the movie. And they go, oh my, I wish I could live there. And that perpetuated this view of slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction. And last, to provide something of a context for the system of segregation. And I'd like for you to remember, if you will, when we read that 1961 version of Reconstruction from the second edition of the American Pageant. Of course, your text is the 13th edition, which was done in the very early 2000s. But if you remember, it had a very different point of view, and I had you do some writing about that. We have certainly talked about segregation. We talked about Jim Crow. And I think Gone with the Wind kind of gives us a context for that. And that context is an important context. Now, how will we watch it? Well, one of the things you noticed, I hope, was that you did not pick up a film note sheet as you came into class. There isn't some sort of viewing journal that you're going to have to fill out at the end of each day after you've watched it. This is, frankly, Gone with the Wind is about as subtle as a brick through a window. You will have no trouble at all watching the film and remembering what happened. If you actually watch it, if you do anything more than put your head on your desk and close your eyes, you'll be able to follow the story. There is going to be a quiz at the end. Don't worry about it. It's basically designed to give me another grade that you will do well on, because there aren't a whole lot of grades in the fourth quarter. Because we've already taken the AP exam. It's done. Our work here is largely finished. Aren't going to be a whole lot more grades. I'm going to assume that some of you probably could use another good grade or two to sort of buck up whatever you've got at this point, and that's the way that quiz was designed. Don't worry about it. Sit back, let the story unfold, watch it. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not going to think about it as we watch it. And our discussions as we go through the film, and it will take 4 class periods for us to watch the film, will center around what I refer to as the myths of Gone with the Wind. And that word myth, I'd like you to think about that for a second. Because basically, a myth is a story that gets invented. It's not necessarily false, but it's a story that gets invented to explain something that you don't have an explanation for. So, why is there winter? Well, the Greeks invented a myth of a Greek goddess whose daughter had to go to the underworld 6 months of the year, and so this goddess allowed the weather to get bad, and so on. Now, these are all stories invented to explain that which cannot be explained. And there are a number of myths in Gone with the Wind that we're going to visit. The first of those myths is something called the plantation myth. And you'll notice there's a still on the screen, just a single shot from the movie. And it depicts this group of enslaved people out in the cotton fields doing the plowing. It's very early in the film. When you see this, watch it carefully, because it is a tremendously important part of the plantation myth. And we will discuss the plantation myth later. But I want you to begin thinking about that phrase, the plantation myth. What could the plantation myth be? And how you see it, especially in the first half hour of Gone with the Wind. So, with that in mind, let's get on with the show. I do hope you enjoy it.